We are in a series through the book of Philippians. Though we've not yet looked at Philippians, and we won't for at least this week and next. But we're looking at the founding of the church in Philippi in the gospel according to Luke, which follows into part 2, which is the book of Acts. And so today we're going to talk about the founding of the church of Philippi. We talked about the positive stuff last week. Paul's initial experience in Philippi is very positive. He goes to near the river where a group is meeting for prayer, probably God-fearers worshiping the Jewish God, but there's no synagogue in that city. And he has an immediate convert, and she's an influential woman, Lydia. Now, we've talked in the past about how in Jewish communities, women were very marginalized. But that's not the way that it is in the Roman culture of this area in Macedonia. Women could be business people, and they could own property, and they could even head households. In fact, the early gospel, when it comes to the early churches, it's almost always hosted in the household of a woman. So you'll notice in Corinthians, the book of Corinthians, they talk about Chloe's household and Lydia's household. This is probably the Lydia. And she's a businesswoman. She's from Thyatira. She's in Philippi selling purple cloth. And she's one of the first converts. So it starts out really well for Paul. But it doesn't stay really well for Paul. And that's where we are in Acts chapter 16, verse 16. The mission in Philippi continues, and it hits a bit of a snag. So if you have access to your Bibles, you're willing to open with me, I'm going to invite you to stand for those who are here or at home who are willing to do this for the reading of the Word this morning. Acts chapter 16, I'm going to begin reading in verse 16, and this is from the New Revised Standard Version. One day, as we were going, and Luke is now with Paul, which is why the we has occurred. It's not that way all through the gospel, but Luke is now with Paul, so he's one of the traveling companions most likely. We only hear about Paul and Silas, but Luke is likely there. And Luke is a Roman citizen, which is why he doesn't get arrested. So is Paul, but apparently he doesn't look very Roman to them, so they treat him like he's not. But Luke doesn't get arrested. One day, as we were going to the place of prayer, we met a slave girl who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners a great deal of money by fortune telling. While she followed Paul and us, she would cry out, "These men are slaves of the Most High God, who proclaim to you a way of salvation." She kept doing this for many days. But Paul, very much annoyed, my favorite story of an exorcism that happens because of annoyance. But Paul, very much annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I order you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And it came out that very hour. But when her owners saw that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. When they had brought them before the magistrates, they said, "These men are disturbing our city. They're Jews and are advocating customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to adopt or to observe." The crowd joined in attacking them, and the magistrates had them stripped of their clothing and ordered them to be beaten with rods. After they had given them a severe flogging, they threw them into prison and ordered the jailer to keep them securely. Following these instructions, he put them in the innermost cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I invite you to be seated. So we see lived out here in the mission of Paul to the church in Philippi, or the soon-to-be church in Philippi, to the people in Philippi, a fulfillment of the call that Jesus gave to those early disciples in the Gospel of Luke. They were given authority over spirits, right, and diseases. And we see the Apostle Paul exercising that authority on this particular mission that he's sent on by the church. Now, we didn't talk about this last week, but I want to just call your attention to it. If you just turn back a couple of books to the Gospel according to Luke. Luke chapter 10, verse 17 tells us the story of the report back of the 70 after they went on this mission and they came back and reported to Jesus the results of it. And I want this to guide our thinking, because this is the kind of reporting I expect we'll be able to do when we fulfill this mission. We're going to be able to come back and say something like this to the Lord. Luke chapter 10, verse 17. The 70 returned with joy, saying, "Lord, in your name even the demons submit to us." He said to them, "I watched Satan fall from heaven like a flash of lightning. See, I've given you authority to tread on snakes and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing will hurt you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice at this, that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in the heavens." Now the question is, how is this to be understood? Jesus is promising them protection and authority. How does that look in real life? Well, that's the book of Acts. Acts tells us what this looks like in real life. And sadly for us, it doesn't mean protection from flogging, and it doesn't mean protection from prison, because both those things happened to Paul. But it does mean protection from something, and authority over things that you and I rarely think about. We probably don't think much in our lives about unclean spirits, about what the Greek people called demons, but we're going to talk about that today. When we ask ourselves, how are these words of Jesus meant to be understood? It's the book of Acts that helps us to understand what kind of promises Jesus is making to us and what kinds of promises he's not. What kinds of protection he is guaranteeing and what kinds of protection he is not guaranteeing. And so Acts helps us to interpret the words of Jesus. That's probably what it means in the gospel according to John, when Jesus tells his disciples that the Spirit would continue to teach them things he had not taught them. The Spirit clarifies. Jesus' teachings are clarified by the lives he calls us to live. And if we refuse to walk in the way he asks us to walk, then the clarification never comes, and we remain confused. So we've got to get moving if we want to learn what these scriptures mean. And so Paul is putting Jesus' promises to the test by putting himself at significant risk, by going to the city of Philippi. And in doing that, he's going to learn what Jesus is going to protect him from and not. And that's going to clarify what Jesus meant to say. Last week, we discussed the sending of God. This week, we're going to discuss what we're likely to encounter as we share the gospel, as we go into the places that God calls us to go. And we have to be ready for this, because the world doesn't want the gospel to break in. Darkness does not like light, and darkness has a way of trying to snuff it out. And so we are going to expect resistance. And in this particular context, there are three things about the culture of Philippi that make the gospel dangerous to it. Three things. The first is that Philippi was a culture of predictions. And we're going to talk about that today. Secondly, Philippi was a culture of prophet. And we're going to talk about that today. And finally, Philippi was a culture of power. Look at Acts chapter 16, verse 16, as we think what it means for the Philippians to have been a culture of prediction. Acts chapter 16, verse 16, they were a culture of prediction. One day, as we were going to the place of prayer, we met a slave girl who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners a great deal of money by fortune telling. While she followed Paul and us, she would cry out, "These men are slaves of the Most High God who proclaim to you a way of salvation." She kept doing this for many days. But Paul, very much annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I order you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And it came out that very hour. So the woman that Paul and Silas encountered in Philippi, literally the Greek says she was a woman who had a pythonic spirit. It's the word for python. It's a snake. Now, the reason it says that is because the Greek god Apollos was often imaged with a serpent, a python, and he was said to be the god who would inspire people with predictions of the future. So that's the pythonic spirit. Some of you have heard of the oracle at Delphi. That's somewhat of a famous location in the ancient world. That oracle was a pythonic spirit, inspired by the god Apollos, they thought, to predict the future. So this woman had she was particularly adept at reading the situation and predicting what would come next. This same phrase, this pythonic spirit, in the ancient world was also used of ventriloquists, probably because they thought that she was being spoken. Her voice was actually the voice of Apollos whenever she would say these things. The Apostle Paul recognized that what was operating in her was an unclean spirit. And we're going to talk a bit about that. And he drove it out. The presence of this girl and her profitability at that time tells us a great deal about the culture of Philippi. We're going to get into that. But I want to get into this unclean spirit first. What the Greeks called a demon, what the Hebrews called unclean spirits. And in order to understand what's at stake in this conversation, we're going to have to rethink about creation and how humans were created in the beginning. What happened? How did God create humans in the very beginning? It says that he gathered together the dust of the earth, The Bible is actually very specific about what kind of material was used to create us. And it's not earth, Adamah. It's not clay. It's not mud. It is, the Hebrew word is afar. And afar is like a pulverized kind of dust. So you might think of it as, have you ever looked at your window? I know your houses are cleaner than this, so I'm just talking about my house. But when the sun is streaming through the window, you remember seeing the dust floating there? That's afar. It's like a pulverized stone. Like if you threw it up in the air, the wind would just catch it and blow it any which way. So it's very insubstantial. That's what God took, and he breathed on it. And the human being became a soul, a nephesh in Hebrew. So in the scriptures, you don't have a soul. You are a soul. You are a combination of the material, insubstantial stuff of reality, afar, and the breath of God. And together they become a soul. Your soul has a body. Your body is part of your soul. And the spiritual breath of God is the other part. And together they make a nephesh, a living being. And that's what humans are. Now, in order to understand what unclean spirits are, you have to be clear on that. Spirit is another word for wind. It's another word for energy. It's another word for power. So essentially, a good spirit is something that motivates the dust to move in a positive direction. An unclean spirit is something that moves, it's a dirty wind. It moves your dust in wrong directions. So when we're talking about spirit, you or I might say today, we're talking about motivations or ideas or things that push us to do one thing as opposed to another. These are spirits in the ancient world. And when it says that this woman had an unclean spirit, what it means is that the thing that was motivating her, the thing that was driving her was dirty. It was filthy. So the Greeks use the word demon because in Greek, demon means disposition. So the Greek word for happiness is the word eudaimonia. Good demon. Eudaimonia is a good demon, and it's translated happy. That's how it's translated. The Greeks thought of demon as disposition. The Hebrew people called them spirits. But in either case, it's the thing that motivates you. So today we live in a materialistic world where the spiritual is denied and we think that all there is afar. And that's not true. And you can't read your scriptures and believe that to be true. There's always a spiritual component to everything that happens to a person because you are equal parts. Well, who knows if you're equal parts? God didn't give us a percentage. But you're at least both spiritual and material. You're both afar and the breath of God. Those two things coming together. And what happens to our afar, and you remember this in 1 John, he tells us to test the spirits to see if they are from God. What is he asking us to do? How do spirits present themselves to us today? Well, they present themselves to you as thoughts, as ideas. Good ideas come from God. Bad ideas mostly come from you or from other places. And what happens, according to the scriptures, is that an idea takes on a personality of its own. And if you give in to bad ideas and you give in to bad thoughts and you focus on them, they become these repetitive earworms that just can't stop. You become obsessed with these particular ideas, and that becomes a personal control over you. Our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, principalities, and powers, right, in the heavenly realms, the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. That's what takes us over. And so demons are not like what the medieval church thought, these little animal-like things that God created or fell from heaven or something, and they're looking to become puppets. They come from you. They start with you. And you listen to these ideas, and they begin to move you in unhealthy directions, and they take you over, and eventually you lose all control to them. But what's happening with this woman is that she lives in a culture in which the future is a currency. And if you could predict it, you could profit from that prediction. And so the idea that's driving her is we can't make a decision today unless we know what's coming tomorrow. We cannot make a decision today unless we know what's coming tomorrow. And that idea sounds very innocent, but as it takes over a culture, it becomes a culture sourced in predictions. And that's what happened there. And over time, she was so good at predicting the future. And some of you have met people like this. They can read the signs and tell you what's coming. They can look at the sky and tell you what kind of weather. They can look at something weird in August and tell you what kind of a winter you're going to have. You meet people like this. That's kind of a spirit, what the ancient world would have called a pathonic spirit. The spirit of prediction, of divination is the more biblical word for it, of predicting what is yet to come. This girl was so proficient at it that eventually the Spirit took her over entirely. She could do nothing else except predict. Every word she heard, she only saw what was coming next. Everything anybody said to her, she just predicted their next step. And she was very, very good at it. Good enough that her owners were making a lot of money based on her predictions. So this girl has been taken over by the Spirit. It has become her master. She can see nothing in the world except the steps ahead of you. That's it. And she's been demon-possessed. The demon, the idea has taken her over. Now, how do I know that's a demonic spirit? One of the things the Israelites were not allowed to do is they were not allowed to engage in divination. Divination. Divination is trying to predict the future by material means. So in the ancient world, there were certain things they did. They would cut open animals and look at their entrails and try to predict the future. Some of you know more contemporary versions of that, where people look at tea leaves, or maybe they read your palm and look at the signs, or they look at the stars and under what sign you're born, and they predict what kind of a person you're going to be, what kind of life. This is divination. You're not allowed to do it. In fact, Jesus is confronting this in Matthew chapter 6 when he says, do not worry about tomorrow. Do not worry about tomorrow. Now, he's not telling us not to plan for the future. That's not what Jesus is necessarily saying. But there are people who are possessed by a spirit of divination who cannot make a move today until they have worried themselves sick about tomorrow. That is demonic because it is opposed to faith. Many times you are going to have to make a decision today that if you were to project that decision into the future would look stupid, would look foolish. But faith in God today means doing what God asks you to do no matter your predictions. You cannot make your today decisions based on how you think this will work for you tomorrow. Not when it comes to obedience. But this woman lived in a different culture. And there was a different prediction that Paul brought to her. He said, the future holds a God who's coming that you better live in light of now. And that is a threatening prediction to make. And this girl and the demon that was now controlling her, she could see where Paul was going. She only had to hear whispers of what he was saying, and she knew where it was going. So she knew he's a threat to her, so she just aligned herself with him and started promoting his gospel. I mean, she could see. Like somehow she read the signs and she knew this was going to take over Philippi. So I might as well get on board. That's what the Spirit was doing to her. And that was irritating Paul. And it always irritates the people of God when someone tries to take the gospel and use it for their own profit. So he casts out the spirit. He frees her from the compulsive desire to interpret the signs. That's what he does. He drives that spirit out of her in the name of Jesus. When the scriptures say that you will have authority over demons, what it means is that the power of the ideas you bring with you in the gospel will drive out the bad ideas that have possessed the people of the earth. That's what it means. And believe me, church, people today are possessed by demonic ideas. And they have taken over. And you can see them. The people have lost their freedom. A little talked about thing in the church is that we actually believe that we get more freedom to choose the longer we walk with God. That slavery is really a matter of following those sinful spirits. And when John says to you, test the spirits to see if they're from God, he's telling you to test the ideas, to test the thoughts, to test the motivations, to test those things that want to push you in a direction. Make sure they're from God, because most are not. Most are not. It's a spirit that will not obey today because of fear of the future. Insider information about upcoming events has proven intoxicating for people throughout history, and much of what constitutes religion around the world centers around controlling the outcomes of our lives by predicting what is to come. The people of Israel were taught to trust God with the future and to only worry themselves about obedience to Him in the present. That's what He was teaching them. Trust the future to me. As long as you are faithful to what I tell you, the future is in my hands. That's what God kept telling them. But they kept saying, well, could you tell me what in your hands looks like? Now, obviously, in our day today, we're not that different than Philippi, but it's more insidious than you think it is. This spirit has taken over everything. Matter of fact, it's in your life right now. Now, obviously, the spiritual, mystical divination stuff is alive, and many of us can avoid that pretty easily. I mean, we've got fortune tellers everywhere, palm readers, channels, horoscopes, tarot card readers, people throwing salt over their shoulders, and all kinds of superstitious stuff to ward off evil spirits, to understand what's coming next. I've talked to many Christians who won't go out without first reading their horoscope. People do this, but that stuff you can avoid. Maybe many here avoid that every single day. But the truth is that just about everything we do in the Western world is still borrowing from that same spirit. We still are somehow in league with a spirit of prediction. And we do it today mostly by mathematics, by science, and by technology. It's the same basic practice. We're just using different means. We're not reading animal entrails. We're reading animal genes. It's different, but it's the same. However we do it, we're driven by estimations of the future. Our economy is driven by mathematical predictions of markets and valuations. That's how it's driven. People predicting what is going to come next. Our retirement accounts are driven by economic forecasts and mathematical estimations of what our number is and what we need to retire. That's what makes our estate planning happen, right? It's about the future. Our healthcare is always trying to predict future problems by properly reading today's signs. These are not illegitimate things, but they can take over. And that's when the demons rise. Now, I'm not criticizing planning ahead. I'm not criticizing that. You'll see that in the scriptures. But I'm pointing out that the spirit of divination, the desire to predict the future so as to make better decisions in the present, is as alive and well today as it was in Paul's day. This is the culture to which the gospel of Jesus was being presented. And the gospel also predicts the future, but a very different future than the people of the earth are looking for. It predicts that Jesus is coming, that a new kingdom is rising, and that what matters most is faithfulness to that kingdom and not survival in this world. That's a very different prediction. Very, very different. And the world will never understand it. And so they ran into a woman who was particularly good at reading those signs and making predictions. And she was so good that they associated her gift with divine inspiration. But Paul recognized that she was enslaved to this idea, that she couldn't talk to another soul without seeing their future ahead of them, that her entire interaction with everybody she met was never in the present, but always in the future, and he set her free. The idea of Jesus drove that spirit out of her, and for the first time she could see something else, something she had not noticed before. But many of us are compelled by ideas that are not of God. And they are controlling our decisions, how we spend our money, where we go, how we eat, how we interact with people. And if they're not godly, they are demonic. And if in enough time, they will become the one who directs your path. And that's what we mean by someone who's demon-possessed. This idea that's taken them over must be driven out because now it runs itself. You might say, why do the demons always know who Jesus is? Because bad ideas always know good ideas when they see them. Bad ideas always know threats to themselves. Always. This is why people get defensive when you confront bad ideas. Because bad ideas will defend themselves. And there's no better idea than Jesus. And everybody knew it. And so whether they were Pharisees or they were Legion in the tombs cutting himself, they all had the same reaction to Jesus. They wanted him dead. And that is the response of the darkness to the truth. When a person is given to predicting the future based on current trends, it becomes an open door, like any bad idea, to an unclean spirit to take over. It can become obsessive, and where people are enslaved to thoughts or ideas or behaviors that diminish their freedom, unclean spirits are not far off. I've certainly met people who can't stop reading the signs. The spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms keep most of us enslaved to fear. Where there is fear running the ship, a demon is there. And the greatest fear is fear of the future. And many of us are enslaved to the demons that wield it. When we bring the gospel into our culture, we have to recognize that this spirit of prediction is going to be confronting us. When you bring the gospel to somebody, one of the things that will make it hard for them to receive is what will happen to their lives if they say yes. How many times have you had that conversation with somebody? They say, well, if I believe in Jesus, this is what's going to happen. My marriage is going to end. My parents are going to disown me. I'm going to have to get rid of all the things I love in life. Like you've heard people say this. That is a Pathonic spirit. That is a spirit that refuses to obey because of the fear of what will come next. This is what happened in Philippi. And it made it worse because they were a culture of profit. You'll notice in the story, now I'm going to go quickly through the other 2 points. They were not only doing this, they were not only addicted to this, they were not only being led by this, but they were making money off of it. And so when the gospel confronted it, not only did it have to change the way they looked at the world and what it meant to make good decisions in the present, but it was also going to cost them something financially. And for that reason, they conspired together to put out the light of the gospel. And that could happen to you too. As we go out and we share the gospel with people who are seeking God and they receive it, there is going to be a reaction. There's going to be consequences in the life of that person that we're not going to be held harmless about. Many of us may be blamed for the destabilization. There are times in which people coming to faith, it costs them dearly in their lives. That's what happened here. This woman was obsessed. She was controlled by this spirit that was driving her to always see the future and never the present. And Paul drove it out, and now her owners couldn't make money off of her anymore. So the conspiracy that came now was to find some way to shut these people up and get them out of town. And that's essentially what happened to Paul. Whenever the culture is profiting from your fear of the future, becoming confident in Christ will destabilize the culture. And there's no way to avoid it. If you really live out the gospel, there will be penalties. Not penalties because God is punishing you, but penalties because you're upsetting something that is profiting people. Can you imagine if every single means of predicting the future was removed and every morning people just read the gospel and did what God asked them to do that day? You imagine how many industries would be put out of business? Now, whether this girl's predictions were accurate or helpful, that was irrelevant to her employer. She was profitable, and that's all that matters. And so they couldn't tolerate it. And many people are that way. They're simply doing what works for them. When we go out to share the gospel, we have to expect that what we tell people will be upsetting not only to them, but to all who benefit from their captivity. And finally, this was a culture of power in Philippi. In order to get their way of life established, people need to exercise power in their culture. And the people who've made money, who are wealthy, who are powerful, they have the ability to con and game the system so it works to their advantage. And because Paul and Silas did not have that authority or power, they were flogged. But when those whose lives are disrupted by the gospel message also have power, there is a disproportionate attempt to use political power to silence the message of the gospel. And that's what happens here. And Jesus said he would protect them from harm, but obviously not from this. So when we go out to share the gospel, we are not being promised that we will not be persecuted by governmental authorities. We're not being promised that people with power will not try to shut us up. We're not even promised that we won't get canceled. And that may very well happen to us. I want you to be ready that the mission that you're going out on is the most joyous of occasions. The reason I put you in the space of the 70 when they returned was to see the joy in that passage, to see that when the demons, when the ideas and the bad spirits that were controlling people were driven out by the word of the gospel that they brought, when even sicknesses that were ensconced and trapping people, they were set free from these things, they were so excited. They came back celebrating to Jesus. And Jesus said, I see Satan falling like lightning. This is how Satan's kingdom ends. When the gospel of Jesus is brought into a life and freedom comes where there was only slavery before. That's how Satan's kingdom ends. Somehow during this season, the Lord is revealing the demons that have taken up their positions in our society, in our hearts, and in our lives. And one of the myths we have is that someone is either filled with the Spirit or they're demon-possessed. And that is not the case in the Scriptures. Sometimes people are in league with demons while trying to follow Jesus. Have you ever read the kings of Israel? It'll say, this king did good in God's eyes, and he followed in the way of his father David, except he didn't take down the high places, or he continued in the sins of Jeroboam. They often had divided hearts. A heart that wanted to follow God, but then a heart that was given to the demonic influences of the world. And that is true for us. It's not always one or the other. We are in control. We are being controlled by ideas. And somehow, church, we need to let go of our fear of the future. That's what I'm saying. That's what this girl prayed on. That's what Philippi was enslaved to, a fear of what comes tomorrow. How do you set yourself free? By obeying today. By obeying today. Now, sometimes you'll think God's asking you to do something that he's not. And you'll pay the price for that. But that's how we learn. That's how we learn to discern the spirits. Sometimes by failure, to listen well. But I believe that the Lord wants to drive out of our congregation this pythonic spirit. And I believe that as you walk in faithfulness to him, sharing the gospel, I believe that he will give you authority by the words of the gospel to drive out these demons, to drive out these ideas that have enslaved people. And so let me give you kind of the first step I believe Jesus is preparing us to make. I said last week that you might knock at the door, and I don't mean a literal door unless God sends you there, but you might knock at the door by saying, how can I help? But the next question might be, do you want to be free of your fear of the future? Now, if there's a demon there in control, you'll get a very, very strong reaction, and you'll know this person's not ready. But some people will say, yes, I want to be free of that, and you can tell them of Jesus. This is the authority over demons that he's given to the church. The authority to drive out the ideas that have possessed and taken over the people of the earth, that keep them moving in directions that are not godly. Because we are dust in the wind. Literally in Hebrew, we are dust in the breath of God. And if we're listening to God, he will move us in healthy directions. Don't give in to the pythonic spirit that runs our world today. If we can cast it out with the idea of Jesus, many will be free.